In 1890, the United States Census Bureau announced a number that would quietly shape American history: 62,979,766. That was the official population of the United States recorded by the 11th census. The figure was published in the government's formal report and archived by the United States Census Bureau. It appeared in tables, bound volumes, and summary bulletins distributed through the government printing office. On its face, nothing about that number seemed unusual. And yet, it created a problem. For decades, census officials had relied on a simple pattern. Population growth followed predictable mathematical curves. Since 1790, the United States had expanded at remarkable speed, from under 4 million to over 50 million in a single century. Immigration, high birth rates, westward expansion. The pattern felt almost mechanical. Then 1890 arrived. Growth slowed, not catastrophically, not dramatically, but measurably. The increase from 1880 to 1890 was roughly 25%, still large, but distinctly smaller than prior decades. Demographers noted it immediately. Analysts wrote cautious commentary in the margins of official reports. The western frontier was declared closed in the same census bulletin. That statement, issued in a short note by Census Superintendent Robert P. Porter, would later be interpreted by historian Frederick Jackson Turner as the symbolic end of an era. But the data itself raised subtler questions. To conduct the 1890 census, the government introduced a new technology: electric tabulating machines designed by Herman Hollerith. His punched card system allowed census clerks to process data at unprecedented speed. It was considered a triumph of modern administration: efficient, scientific, objective. But it also meant something new. The original handwritten enumeration schedules, the detailed household forms, were no longer the central working documents. They were intermediaries, raw input for machine counting. The official population total survived. Most of the individual records did not. In January 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C., where census materials were stored. Newspapers reported smoke damage and water exposure. An internal investigation followed. According to memoranda preserved in the National Archives, approximately 25% of the 1890 schedules were destroyed outright. The rest were damaged by water, mildew, and neglect. Officials evaluated the materials. They deemed them unsalvageable. In 1934, under authorization from Congress, the remaining fragments were formally destroyed. Today, if you attempt to locate the full 1890 federal census manuscripts, the line-by-line accounting of nearly 63 million individuals, you will find almost nothing. A few fragments survive for selected counties in Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, South Dakota, Texas, and the District of Columbia. The rest is gone. For genealogists, this is a known frustration. The so-called 1890 census gap is frequently discussed in family history circles. Researchers move from 1880 to 1900 and find a void, a blank decade. For demographers, however, the gap is more than an inconvenience. It is a rupture in the data chain. Between 1880 and 1900, America transformed. Industrialization accelerated. Immigration surged. Cities expanded at historic speed. Railroads stitched together vast territories. Millions arrived from Europe through ports like Ellis Island, though its main operations would not begin until 1892. And yet, the most detailed national record of that moment is missing. 63 million names, addresses, occupations, birthplaces, family structures, erased. Officially, it was an accident compounded by bureaucratic decision-making. Fires were common in government buildings of the era. Record preservation standards were inconsistent. Space was limited. The damaged volumes were judged beyond repair. The simplest explanation is often correct, but something about the timing feels heavier. The 1890 census was the first to use machine tabulation at scale. It marked a transition from handwritten governance to data processing. It defined congressional representation for a rapidly industrializing nation.
Subscribe to
It
my
documented
channel.
the end of the frontier and the rise of the urban age. And it is the only complete federal census of the 19th century that no longer exists. Why that one? Perhaps it was random misfortune. Perhaps the damage truly rendered it useless. Or perhaps the shift from paper to punch cards made the original records feel expendable in a way earlier censuses did not. Still, one fact remains. In 1890, nearly 63 million Americans were individually counted, and within a generation, their individual traces were almost entirely destroyed. What happens to a nation's memory when an entire population disappears from its own archives? What happens when the archive itself becomes fragile? The destruction of the 1890 census schedules was not the only large-scale record loss in the early 20th century. It was part of a pattern, subtle, bureaucratic, often procedural. In 1897, a fire tore through the Patent Office building in Washington. Later, in 1921, the Commerce Building blaze damaged census materials. In 1934, Congress authorized the destruction of what remained of the 1890 schedules after archivists determined they held no permanent value. Fire, neglect, bureaucratic review, authorized destruction. The language appears repeatedly in federal record-keeping reports of the era. To understand the scale of loss, historians turn to the documentation preserved by the National Archives, which was not formally established until 1934, the very year the final 1890 census fragments were eliminated. Before that, federal records were scattered across departments, stored in basements, attics, rented warehouses. There was no unified preservation policy. Paper was considered temporary. Space was expensive. The 1890 census was not the only casualty of this administrative culture. The 1890 Special Census of Union Veterans and Widows, a supplemental schedule documenting Civil War service, was largely destroyed in the same 1921 fire. Only scattered fragments remain today. That supplemental schedule is particularly significant. It documented aging veterans from a war that had defined the nation. By 1890, the Civil War generation was entering old age. The schedules recorded regiments, service histories, disabilities, pensions. Now, most of those detailed lists are gone. The official explanation remains consistent: accidental fire followed by rational disposal. Yet the period between 1890 and 1934 saw something else: a transformation in federal authority, the expansion of regulatory agencies, the birth of modern administrative government. The census itself grew more complex, questions multiplied, categories expanded, race classifications shifted, occupation codes refined. And while the machine-tabulated totals survived, the handwritten human details vanished. Historians sometimes describe this moment as a shift from narrative record-keeping to statistical abstraction. Individuals became data points. Totals mattered more than stories. Perhaps that is all this is, an artifact of modernization. But the anomalies continue. In 1906, the original records of the 1890 census were transferred to the newly constructed Commerce Building for storage. Reports at the time noted overcrowded conditions and fire hazards. Requests for improved preservation were slow to materialize. Delay, budget constraints, administrative inertia. By the time of the 1921 fire, water to extinguish the flames damaged thousands of volumes beyond repair. Investigators concluded that salvage would be too costly. Cost-benefit analysis entered the archive. And then there's the matter of the 1890 population itself. The total count, 62,979,766, stood as the official number. But demographers later noted discrepancies in regional growth rates. Some Western territories showed dramatic fluctuations. Urban districts reported sudden expansions that outpaced infrastructure. Were these normal variations in a rapidly industrializing nation? Almost certainly. Yet without the original household schedules, modern researchers cannot reevaluate the raw data. They cannot audit enumeration errors. They cannot trace specific communities in detail. For genealogists, the loss is personal. For historians, it is structural. And for a small but persistent group of alternative researchers, it is something else. Around the late 20th century, a fringe theory began circulating in obscure publications and early internet forums. It suggested that the destruction of the 1890 census concealed evidence of a population discrepancy, an argument that the official count masked either overcounting or undercounting on a massive scale. Some variations of the theory go further, proposing that the late 19th century experienced undocumented demographic upheaval, war, epidemic, or catastrophe, later minimized in official histories. There is no credible archival evidence supporting these claims. Mainstream historians attribute the destruction to documented fires and bureaucratic decisions. The paper trail exists. Internal memos, congressional authorizations, inventory reports. Still, the theory persists. Why? Perhaps because the loss feels too large. 63 million lives documented and then largely erased within 3 decades. The scale creates emotional gravity, and absence invites imagination. Even within conventional scholarship, the missing 1890 census has practical consequences. Researchers studying migration patterns between Reconstruction and the Progressive Era must rely heavily on the 1880 and 1900 datasets. That 20-year gap forces interpolation, estimates, statistical modeling, in other words, educated guesswork. The irony is striking. The only census to use cutting-edge data technology becomes the least accessible in human detail. The machine output survives, the handwriting does not. Was it simple misfortune amplified by bureaucratic pragmatism? Or does the story reveal something more subtle about how modern states prioritize information? Perhaps I'm seeing patterns. Yet consider this. By 1934, when the final 1890 schedules were destroyed, the federal government had begun centralizing archival authority under the newly formed National Archives. Preservation standards were improving. Fireproof vaults were being constructed. But for the 1890 census, it was too late. The decision had already been made. The loss was deemed acceptable. And that raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. If nearly an entire nation's worth of individual records could be written off as having no permanent value, what else might have been considered expendable?
What does it mean for a country to forget a year? Not symbolically, literally. The 1890 census was meant to capture the United States at a hinge moment. The frontier declared closed, industrial cities rising, immigration accelerating, former Civil War soldiers aging into memory. The official total remains printed in bound volumes, but the people behind the number are largely inaccessible. A name in 1880, a name in 1900, silence in between. For genealogists tracing lineage, that silence is immediate. A great-grandparent appears as a child in one census, then reemerges as an adult 20 years later. Marriages occurred, children were born, occupations changed, moves happened across counties or states. The decade that explains those transitions is missing. This absence shapes research strategies. It shapes family narratives. It even shapes regional histories. Entire neighborhoods that existed in 1890 cannot be reconstructed household by household because the schedules are gone. Architecture sometimes becomes the surrogate archive. Buildings erected in the 1880s still stand in cities like Chicago or New York City. Brick row houses, industrial lofts, farmhouses on Midwestern plains. They testify silently to occupancy. Someone lived there in 1890. We know the walls, we know the streets. We do not know the names. Language preserves fragments. Newspaper archives survive. Church baptismal records endure. Local tax rolls fill partial gaps. But the unified national snapshot, the synchronized portrait of nearly 63 million individuals, is absent. Institutional forgetting does not always require intent. Sometimes it requires only triage. Records judged damaged, space deemed scarce, budgets constrained. And yet the decision to destroy what remained of the 1890 census schedules in 1934 carries symbolic weight. It happened the same year the federal government formalized its archival preservation efforts. The moment the nation committed to safeguarding memory, it also finalized the erasure of one of its most comprehensive 19th century records. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply too late to save what water and mildew had already consumed, but the effect lingers. Modern historians rely heavily on quantitative data. They chart urbanization curves. They analyze demographic shifts. They debate immigration impacts. For 1890, they depend on aggregated tables rather than individual entries, totals without texture. It changes the questions scholars can ask. It changes the certainty with which they can answer. Memory in institutions often survives as summary rather than detail. The ledger remains, but the signatures fade. And there's something quietly unsettling about the fact that the first census to rely on machine tabulation became the census least accessible in its human form. The transition from pen to punch card marked the beginning of a new administrative era. Efficiency improved, data processing accelerated, governance modernized. But paper schedules, once central, became temporary instruments, disposable. Perhaps that is the real story, not disappearance through conspiracy or catastrophe, but disappearance through modernization, through abstraction, through the steady prioritization of totals over testimonies. Maybe I'm connecting dots that were never meant to touch. Still, consider the generational impact. Children born in 1890 would come of age during World War I. They would shape the politics of the 1920s and endure the Great Depression. Yet the detailed record of their households at birth, parents, siblings, neighbors, is mostly irretrievable. History remembers their adulthood. It does not clearly remember their beginning. The silence becomes part of the national narrative, even if few notice it. Archivists today work under strict preservation standards, climate-controlled vaults, digitization initiatives, redundant storage systems. The loss of 1890 stands as a cautionary tale within professional circles. But caution does not restore names. In the end, the anomaly is both mundane and profound. A fire, administrative review, authorized destruction, all documented, all procedural. And yet the result is staggering. Nearly 63 million individual stories, once written in ink, stacked in government storage, then declared beyond saving. Perhaps the simplest explanation is correct, or perhaps the story reveals how easily memory can thin when it is stored on paper and entrusted to institutions still learning how to protect it. We inherit the totals, we inherit the statistics. What we do not inherit are the pages themselves. Somewhere in Washington in 1921, damp volumes were examined and judged unsalvageable. In 1934, the remaining fragments were discarded under formal authorization, and with them went a year that still exists in numbers, but not in names. An entire population, counted carefully in 1890, now survives mostly as a single line in a ledger stored on a shelf at the National Archives.